So we've been talking about using materials while in Blender's default render engine called Blender Render here. Even though the Cycles render engine is the superior engine, there's still good reasons to at least have some base knowledge about Blender's default render engine. For one, there's some effects that you can only accomplish using Blender Render. Any assets for games that you might be working on or designing, you're only going to be able to edit and view the materials for those game assets via the Blender Render engine. So you're going to need to know your way around the Blender Render engine if you're going to be working with game assets. So we don't want to spend too much more time in the Blender Render engine, but we definitely want to have at least a basic foundation of Blender's basic material system so it doesn't trip us up down the road. Okay, so over here in our Properties panel, with our cube selected, if we click on the Material tab, we can see right now this cube has no materials. And if we click on this button, we can see all the materials in the entire file, and we can see also there are no materials in the file. Now I want to mention real quickly, this properties panel can sometimes be a bit confusing because it displays information related to the entire file, the entire scene, but it also displays information about the specific object you have selected. So pretty much everything from this render tab over to this world tab, which is for environments and backgrounds and things like that. These four tabs are information related to your entire file, your entire scene kind of deal. And then starting at this orange cube tab here, everything over to the right here, this is all stuff related to the specific object you have selected. So everything from here to here will be the same no matter what object you have selected. So I could double right click over here and create a cylinder. And I could click on these different objects, and all the information on this tab, and this tab is all going to be the same because it's all related to the file. Whereas starting from here all the way over to the right, all of these will only display information related directly to your selected object. So sorry if that information was already painfully obvious to you. I just feel like that's something that can trip people up about the properties panel. Okay, so I'm going to click on this cylinder. Press X to delete it because I don't really need it, and then right click on this cube to recenter my 3D cursor. Click back on this material tab, which of course we have nothing. And if we go ahead and click new, this will give us a new material. In the last video, we covered the main Blender Render material shading options, which are available when using the default Blender Render material type of surface, which is sort of your main workhorse of the Blender Render material, if you will. Pretty much most Blender Render materials will use this type of surface. But there's also this available three other material types that can be used: wire, volume, and halo. But if we click back on the wire material type, notice that the wire and the surface have the same exact shading options. And these will produce nearly the same results, only if we have the particular material we are using set to wire and we render our image out. The object using the material set to the wire type will render out as a wireframe, which is pretty cool. So this can be really useful for showing schematics, displaying how you sort of built up your scene or you designed your character or what have you, making short wireframe animations, that kind of stuff. So for instance, if I were to press go back here, I'll go ahead and switch this material back to surface, and let's just rename this material. We'll just call it basic, I guess. And so we could maybe make a table out of this cube. So I could press T to bring up my tool shelf, press the bevel button to bevel this out, tab to go into edit mode, select this top face here, E to extrude, and then press Alt to loop select this loop of faces around here. Then I could press Shift E to do an inset and immediately click, and then double tap space to bring up my operator menu, which allows me to adjust the last tool I used, which was that inset. And then I could control this depth value and just extrude all these out like this, or something, just to have some kind of simple little table here. And so say we had some sort of sci-fi scene where we had like some sort of spinning transparent globe or something, we could use the wireframe material type to do that. So if I were to press tab to go back into object mode and press Shift A, and under mesh add a UV sphere, G to grab, and just press S to scale to bring this up like this. We could go ahead and give this cube a new material, click new, and we could rename it sphere, wire, or whatever, it doesn't really matter. Switch this over to wire material type, and we could make this green. We could turn on some transparency, maybe drop it down a bit. And so if we back up here in our camera area and press our render preview button, we can see this kind of green wireframe sphere on here, which we could animate the alpha value, the transparency going up and down. So I could turn my render preview off. I could have this at 0, press I to insert a keyframe, and then use my right mouse button or hold middle mouse button down to drag my cursor down to say 5 seconds or so, and bring this alpha value back up to 1. Press I to insert another keyframe. As you can see, that shows up down there. Drag this down to 10, drop this back to 0, and I could press I. Then we could have it doing something like maybe say rotating. So I could come back here, the sphere selected, click on my dimensions tab, and I could press I over this Z value here under the dimensions. Make sure the timeline's back to 0. So the keyframe gets entered at frame 0, press I, and then bring this down here and then enter some value. However many times you want this to spin around would be whatever number times 360. So if we were to do 1080, that would be spinning around 3 full times. And then once we enter that, we could press I again. And so now if I press back and press play here, we can see down here in our render preview what this will sort of look like with this sphere rotating and the transparency, going in and out, which is pretty sweet. And if we were really curious to see what this would look like fully rendered out, we could go ahead and do that. So I'll do that real quick. So the first thing I want to do is drag my timeline cursor down to 10 seconds here and see how long that is. Well, we can see here that it says we're at frame 300, also here in the 3D view. So we would want our animation to start at 0 and end at 300. So I'd click here, press 300, and that way whenever I render this animation out, it doesn't render more than 300 frames because I don't want it to just sit there and render a bunch of the same still frame for no reason. That would be a waste of time. And to ensure that this renders out really quickly, I could drop the size of the render from 55% of what it's set to, which it's set to 1920 by 1080, as we can see here under the render tab. But I could drop this down even lower since I'm just making a little test animation, so this will all render out quicker to say about 25% there. And then come here and press render animation. Okay, that's finished up there. So now if I come down here and press play animation, this will bring up Blender's little animation player, and we can see the sphere rotating and fading in and out. So just a kind of a basic example of how you could use this material type in an animation. So I'll go ahead and close that out there and press go back, and I'll go ahead and close this up. The only thing that the wire materials kind of suck for is affecting other stuff in the scene. Basically anything using a material type, a Blender render material type of wire, is not going to show up in reflections or emit light onto other things, which is kind of lame. So for instance, if we click back on this basic table here and we turn its mirror value on and its reflectivity all the way up, we come down here in our camera area, and I drag this back to a time where this is at full transparency, and press render preview. Oh well, it looks like I left the mirror on the sphere. Let me turn that off real quick. Press that, click back on here, and turn its mirror value off. If we come back here, and with the mirror value on for the table, and we press render preview, notice that its reflection isn't showing up on this table, which kind of sucks. So if I were to say press Shift A and add a Suzanne monkey head here, press W to give it some smoothing. If we press render preview now, we can see the Suzanne head reflection showing up in the table, but we can't see it for the wireframe material. So that's about the only limitation with the wire material type. There's still a lot of really neat stuff that you can do with it, but just be aware it's got that limitation.